Good evening, everyone. Good evening and a very warm welcome to the Faculty of Arts and Humanities and the 12th FT Prince Memorial Lecture. My name is Miguel Mera. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, and it's a real joy to introduce you to this evening's event. These lectures were named for FT Prince, the South African-born poet and scholar, who helped actually set up the University of Southampton's English department over 70 years ago. His own poetry drew on everything from African kingship to urban graffiti, and our speakers in this series have been similarly expansive, from Isabel Armstrong describing the power of women's experimental poetry, or Andrew Macmillan on putting together a queer poetry anthology with Mary Jean Chan, or Malika Booker on writing poetry that speaks back to the Bible. We're very lucky to be partnering again this year with the Winchester Poetry Festival to present this lecture. And I think we have some flyers which can outline the incredible work of the WPF, which we'll share, from running national poetry prizes to putting on a biennial festival. This event is also run in association with the English department's own Centre for Modern and Contemporary Writing, which supports interdisciplinary research on 20th and 21st century writing and culture. So I very much hope you enjoy this event. We couldn't be more delighted to welcome poet, musician and academic Anthony Joseph to give tonight's FT Prince lecture. I'll hand over now to Toby Litt, our Head of Creative Writing, to introduce him properly.
Hello, thank you for coming. Thank you to those who are online too. I hope you can see and hear us. I'm not going to give a long biographical introduction to Dr. Anthony Joseph, because I've known him from before, and he's just confessed to stealing some of my teaching materials. But I'm just going to give an informal introduction, and because this is the FT Prince Memorial Lecture, I thought I would read one of his poems, and maybe that's something that we could do for each year of the lecture. So the reason that this is happening this year is it's 100 years since the first Surrealist manifesto. So that's the reason that Anthony Joseph has chosen to talk about Black Surrealism and the relation to his work. So it's 100 years since this really kind of breakthrough document, this kind of challenge to rational thought in terms of writing, and it came along at a time, obviously, that was very different from ours. But I think that there are a lot of similarities, and a challenge to rationalism, or thinking about what rationalism is and whether it's the best way to go about writing is very current. I think about it in my own teaching. I think about it in my own writing. So we're going to hear a lecture. I've read it already. It's fantastic. So we're going to hear that. Anthony won the T.S. Eliot Prize last year, which is probably the most prestigious poetry prize for a collection. That was for his collection Sonnets for Albert. I hope that while we're in here, October books will appear outside and you'll be able to buy copies of that. And also Anthony's new book, which is his selected poems, Precious and Impossible, which collects from his previous collections over the years, from his first, and contains previously unpublished work. Anthony is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. We're not going to talk about the novels so much today, but he's the author of 3 novels, fantastic novels, and he's recorded 9 albums, including, well, often with the Spasm Band, his band. So I'm going to read a poem which I showed Anthony earlier, and he said, "That's sad." And I said, "Yeah, your poem's quite sad too." But this seemed to me to be something that could lead into some ideas of surrealism and what we know and what we do not know. And it's a poem from the same collection as F.T. Prince's greatest hits, which is a poem called Soldiers Bathing. And this is the question. And after I've finished, I will hand over to Anthony, and he can start his lecture. So the question. And so we too came where the rest have come, to where each dreamed, each drew the other home, from all distractions to the other's breast, where each had found and was the wild bird's nest. For that we came and knew that we must know the thing we know of, but we did not know. We said then, what if this without now no more than a faint shade of what we dreamed before, if love should here find little joy or none, and done, it were as if it were not done? Would we not love still? What if none can know the thing we know of, but we do not know? For we know nothing but that long ago we learnt to love God, whom we cannot know. I touch your eyelids, that one day must close, your lips as perishable as a rose, and say that all must fade before we know the thing we know of, but we do not know. F.T. Prince. Give him a round of applause.
Hi. So thank you, Toby. Thank you to everyone that's managed to get me here. Thanks to Louise, especially for doing all the organization. So yeah, the lecture is going to be in two parts, really. There's going to be a more sort of formal part, which is a lecture where I'll talk through some of these ideas around surrealism and my work, and then I'll do a bit of reading from the new collection, hopefully of poems which illustrate what I was speaking about in the lecture. So the lecture is called The Frequency of Magic, and the frequencies of magic, and that'll be explained in a little bit why it's called that. So in 1995, all the way back, probably before some of you were born, I was working as a bookseller at Dillon's, which was bought by Waterstones, but back then it was still Dillon's. It was a shop in Kensington High Street in London. So the previous year, in 94, I'd published my first collection of poetry, Desafinado. And I'd begun at that time in 95 to sort of think about the next collection and what I was going to do. I was living at Hornsey in London at the time, North London, and I was a member of the Islington Poetry Workshop, which met once a week near Finsbury Park. It was a workshop that was run by three poets, Bruce Barnes, Francis Presley, and Brian Doherty. And I think I mentioned this group because that was my first introduction at that time to the avant-garde, to ideas around the avant-garde, to language poets, to surrealism, to an understanding of what my work was and where it was situated. At this point in my life, in sort of 1994, 95, I was obsessed with poetry. I would spend whole afternoons in bookshops on Charing Cross Road. Some of you guys would know Charing Cross Road in London, right? At that time, there were about 8 shops, 8 bookshops. There was a lot. Now there's probably only 2. But at that time, you could walk that whole stretch and just go from bookshop to bookshop to bookshop. It was great. And I used to spend hours, days in these shops. All of them, most of them had bargain basement. Just you could find a load of obscure, unread poetry there. So that was what I did. I was obsessed with it. So I grew up in Trinidad. So having that much access to poetry, to follow any sort of direction my interest took was unheard of. I didn't have that experience in Trinidad. It was very hard to find poetry and books that I wanted to find. Sorry. So I had very eclectic taste at that time. I was reading people like Louis Zukofsky. I was reading Ginsberg. I was moving from Baraka to Blake. And maybe because I'd been writing for a number of years at that point, the things that I was really interested in were experimental writers, but people that were taking risk and doing different things with language. Ulipo poets, Black writers especially. But at that time, there wasn't much of a black writing scene going on in London. There really wasn't. Black poets weren't being published. We weren't being celebrated in the mainstream. It was very hard to find a black scene. There wasn't really one. There were few writers dotted around. And in any case, I think coming from Trinidad, this sort of preoccupation with black identity wasn't at the center of my work. It would move closer to the center the longer I lived in London, of course, but at that time, I was just more interested in being really experimental with what I was doing. So between the poetry workshop and the bookshops on Charing Cross Road, what developed was a particular aesthetic and a particular interest in the avant-garde, but something that was also diasporic. We'll get back to the bookshop shortly, but I wanted to give some more sort of historical context, which I think would be kind of necessary. So I've written since I was about 11 years old, which is a long time ago now. I started writing because of a love for music. I wanted to essentially write my own songs and my own song lyrics. That's what kind of drew me to writing. And that sort of practice of trying to write lyrics eventually evolved into a practice of writing poetry. And that's what I was doing, even if I didn't know what I was doing. In school, we read a mixture of, classical English poetry, a lot of Keats and a lot of Shakespeare and, that sort of thing. And also a few Caribbean poets. And by the time I left school, the curriculum was more or less half and half, if not slightly more Caribbean, which was great. But I was interested in music. I wasn't really interested, during the lessons or whatever, I was just interested in music. And I grew up in Trinidad. I grew up listening to calypso music, which is the sort of national art form of Trinidad. I grew up, I listened to all types of music, to reggae, to pop music on the radio, to whatever. But calypso was more intimate, and I had more sort of a more sort of closer relationship to it. I was fascinated by calypso artists and how they used language, especially how they used double entendre, how they used puns and allusions, how they matched word to melody. There was too in calypso what the calypsonian David Rudder calls the blade behind the smile. Calypsonians were masters of critique, what we call in Trinidad picong, which is the art of discrediting, exposing, and critiquing individuals and subverting the status quo. Of course, this revolutionary impulse is built into the calypso since at its inception, the calypso emerged as a subversive form of resistance, a sometimes dangerous tool, but one which you could dance to. The Calypsonian was a griot. He was the newspaper of the people. Calypso was, and still is to a certain extent, our gangster rap. So the roots of Calypso are quite unclear. No one's actually sure when it started, but we can trace some of it, at least, to the 18th century, when enslaved people in Trinidad began to find ways to articulate their experience in song. And eventually this music began to forge a distinctly Caribbean identity. And at the height of the colonial project, the Calypsonian was ostracized, vilified, and prosecuted. It was actually only with the unraveling of the colonial period, sort of in the mid 1950s onwards, that Calypso began to be celebrated as a national art form. Earl Lovelace, who's a Trinidadian author and philosopher, says, I don't know if you can see it. Yes, you can. He says, when we woke up to the realization that we were independent and that independence meant having a culture that we could call our own, we discovered that all we had that might be termed indigenous or native was what had been created or reassembled and maintained here by those at the bottom of the economic ladder. The Calypso, I think, deserves its own lecture. I don't think we have the time to go through the whole scope of it. But what I can say is that the Calypso is a really important force for revolutionary praxis and nationhood in Trinidad and in the Caribbean. And it's had a major impact on Trinidadian writers in terms of how we approach, how we view, how we face the rest of the world with a sense of respect. Here we have a people who were transplanted, and not just Africans, but East Indians, Chinese, people from all over the world arriving in this small island in the Caribbean, which is only 5,000 square meters, and bringing their own musical systems and songs and merging it with French and Spanish and English and Dutch instrumentation and creating something brand new. The first Calypso recordings predate the recording of jazz by 5 years. In 1912, Lovey's string band traveled from Trinidad, to New York, where they made a series of recordings for the Columbia label. In 1914, the second Calypso recordings, including the first sung in English, were done by a chantwell. We call a chantwell an early version of a Calypsonian, Julian Whiterose. And in July 1924, 3 months before the publication of Breton's first Surrealist manifesto, the Trinidadian vaudeville singer Sam Manning recorded 2 sessions for OK in New York. So Frantz Fanon talks about how the native artist, what he calls the native artist, in the beginning stages of forging a national consciousness, but still within the chains of the colonizer, will try to assimilate and to mimic and to prove to the occupying power a mastery of the colonizer's language. It's a way of gaining some sort of self-respect as well, I guess, by saying, you know, I too can write a sonnet. I too can write a verse like you. Fanon says his inspiration is European, and we can easily link up these works with definite trends in the literature of the mother country. This is the period of unqualified assimilation. We find in this literature, coming from the colonies, the Panaceans, the Symbolists, and the Surrealists. And it is in this frame that we can locate and begin to think about the Calypso of the 1920s and 30s, which carries echoes of the things that you might find in English vaudeville and musical theater, and literary devices which were very much of the time. In this early modernist period, Calypso was equally interested in breaking and remaking language, a language which until then had been used to subjugate. So you find a lot of Calypso of the time challenging and dismantling the empire, and in particular, dismantling its language. As Kamau Braithwaite, the great Barbadian scholar and poet, says, it was in language that the slave was perhaps most successfully imprisoned by his master, and it was in his misuse of it that he most effectively rebelled. So I read this alongside Breton's desire that surrealism should also be a political movement, should also be a political tool, that the surreal and the revolutionary are linked, and that surrealism could be a tool for social change and a challenge to the bourgeois. But I'm not suggesting that Calypsonians of the time were listening or reading Breton or reading the Surrealist Manifesto. But this approach to language, when coupled with a tradition of wordplay inherited from West African griots and riddle spinners, as literary trends do, somehow tapped into the zeitgeist of the times. So at this point, I want to pause to make a distinction between a couple of things. This came up in an interview I was doing for the BBC a couple of weeks ago. We kept talking about surrealism and surrealism and surrealism, and started talking about music and surrealism. And they were saying, well, what music is surrealist? What music, you know? And it got me to, I had to make a distinction and say to them, like, you know, there's two kinds of thing that we're talking about here. We're talking about surrealism as practice, and there's also surrealism as effect. When I say there is surrealism as practice, I mean there's surrealist techniques that surrealist writers and artists use, like automatic writing, automatism, games of chance, frottage, cut up, juxtapositions. These are the practices that we do to produce uh, surrealist art. But then there's also surrealism as an effect, right? I mean, there's work that exhibits qualities of surrealism, which may or may not have been the result of surrealist practice, but which may induce these transpositions in the reader. So I know Breton was legendarily very strict about surrealism and actually threw Salvador Dali out of the movement because Dali, in one of Dali's paintings, I think Breton could recognize a face of a politician or whatever, and said, well, you obviously pre-planned and thought that this is not automatic. So, and you know, but you know, if you look at Dali's work, that's the effect of surrealism. That's the surrealist effect rather than surrealist practice. I don't think Dali is using automatic painting to produce the work. I don't think he's using chance. Um, so I think that what most people associate with surrealism now is the surrealist effect. Not many people, not many artists, well, I mean, maybe some of them are using automatic writing and trying to write in trance. I don't think a lot of people are doing that, but we can definitely produce surrealist effects in work. And I say that because, you know, when you listen to music that could be called or have influence of surrealism, a lot of times you're listening to an artist who is producing a particular effect rather than doing a particular practice to produce that effect. So I want to just talk briefly about the mighty spoiler. So the mighty spoiler, who died in 1960, died relatively young, is often described as a poet of the absurd. He's a comic fantasist, a surrealist, a trickster figure, which is similar to Anansi or Brer Rabbit. It's a real trickster figure, and an alcoholic, and that killed him. This is one of his songs. The lyrics are one of his songs. I think we should look at the lyrics first because once he starts singing, we might lose it. Money in the bank. My cousin died many years in Toko, and she leave a lot of money for spoilo. My cousin died many years in Toko, and she leave a lot of money for spoilo. Now people saying that I lousy, saying that the spoiler don't spend his money. But if they put the world in a pitch oil tin, I cannot even pay a cent to see the thing spin. Just because I have my money in the bank since the age of 9 and them big shot put theirs on mine, I have to wait again just a couple years in order to get out mine, they have to take off theirs. There are numerous examples of this kind of calypso, which is humorous, absurd, really ridiculous events being described. The Mighty Shadow is another Calypsonian I want to talk about briefly, who's a bit more recent. Shadow died, I think, maybe about 2 years ago now. Shadow turns an idea of blackness upon its head. He calls himself the king from hell. He dresses in black, he was very mysterious, didn't give a lot of interviews. Um, he dressed in this sort of midnight rubber iconography, you know, but very politically charged calypso, um, but quite absurd as well. And his music blended things like jazz, African music, soul music, reggae, calypso, of course. Like spoiler, a lot of Shadow's lyrics were used humor and the absurd as a tool for social critique. Shadow was also a romantic poet concerned with romantic love and a black subjectivity which took shape during the Black Power revolutions of the 60s and 70s. But musically, he's out there on his own. This is an excerpt from a tune called Moonwalking. But I want to move on. So we have that calypso we have the calypso, which I said is a huge history, which I don't have time to go into now, but I invite you to investigate it yourself. Calypso for me is yeah, it's a real, it has a revolutionary impulse and it exists simply to assert itself, assert a particular kind of Caribbeanness and blackness in the face of colonialism. The other important aspect that I wanted to talk about, or at least of my experience of a form of surrealism growing up, is the Trinidad Carnival. The carnival in Trinidad, has anyone been to Trinidad here for carnival? Mm. Mm? Okay. I can't even begin to talk about it. It's incredible. It's a ritual that begins. I mean, the whole thing begins like now. People start preparing for carnival, and it builds and builds in tension and excitement until sometime in February or March. When these 2 days people just explode. Um, the carnival is surrealism in motion. Uh, the art of costuming or mass, which is an integral part of the carnival, features costumes and portrayal which go beyond the absurd and which tap into regions, the traditions of magical realism and the fantastic reach. Here are a few, this is just a few costumes. They are all costumes that were designed by an artist called Peter Minshall. Between 1983 and 1985, Minshall presented a trilogy of bands for the annual carnival. There was River in 83, Callaloo in 1984, and the final one was the Golden Calabash in 1985. And when I say bands, carnival bands, I mean up to 10,000 people in a band, costumed, moving through the city. Right? And in this parade and masquerade, we really see what I think is surrealism as practice and performance at the same time. So, I was making this distinction. This is both practice, the practice of surrealism, and that you don't actually know what is going to happen. It's completely up to chance. And there's performance, the performance of it. So, for example, in one of the bands, I think it was Golden Calabash. No, in River, in the episode called River, Minshall had the whole band, like up to 10,000 people wearing all white. So everyone wore white. And at some point, as they were moving through, going across what we call the big yard stage, this is where each band gets judged. Everyone had a spray can with paint and started spraying each other. So everyone got covered in this multicolored paint. So that's for me is surrealism in practice. You end up with a situation where 10,000 people are all transforming from white into these multicolored costumes. It was really, it was transcendent. Minshall says, I provide the means for the human body to express its energy. Mass is a vehicle for the expression of human energy. Flesh and blood powers the mass. The energy passes from performer to spectator like an electrical charge. A moment that will not last. It passes quickly, leaving the mind singed. Our aesthetic is performance, the living now. This is a shot from the band I was telling you about. This is what they look like at the end. They're just completely covered in all sorts of paint. So the carnival for me is really the world's supreme festival of the surreal. It's become very commercial now, but at its heart, with roots in African ceremonies of masking and costuming, and in the European Saturnalian festivals of antiquity, and the French bal masque, and English vaudeville and theater. It's the result of a deep global tradition of transcendence and transformation which predate surrealism. And in a way, my issue with surrealism, I don't really have a big issue with surrealism, but I would say that again, we have the Columbus effect, where something that has existed for antiquity is suddenly discovered by Europe and renamed into something else. And I think Breton would be the first one to agree with that because, surrealism draws on things that were present in a lot of ancient cultures, in the same way that Picasso was inspired by a lot of African sculpture and African craft. Surrealism, even if you're, I don't know, if you're a Bible reader, you can find aspects of surrealism in the Bible or surrealist effects, access to the unconscious in lots of different places. But, it is an ism that was renamed. Anyway, back to the bookshop. So I started talking about working in a bookshop. I want to go back there briefly. So I was working as a bookseller. And the shop was huge. It was a huge cavernous space with 3 floors. And I worked on the ground floor and the fiction floor. Upstairs was cookery, art, all that good stuff. And then in the basement, it was poetry and literary criticism, philosophy. And working down there was a guy called James Oscar, who was another bookseller, who was a French-Canadian writer with Trinidadian roots, who was living in the UK at the time. And James changed my life. I haven't got a photo of him. Well, I do, but I'm not going to show you because I haven't got permission from him. But you can Google him. His name is James Oscar Jr. He's a dude. He's a very suave-looking dude. He changed my life because he introduced me to Frantz Fanon. He introduced me to Aimé Césaire, introduced me to Léon Damas, introduced me to Negritude, to Antonin Artaud, to Edward Glissant, to Ted Jones. Ted Jones was a Black surrealist poet, an American Black surrealist poet who spent a lot of time in Europe and traveled the world, actually. Really interesting character, also a musician, played the trumpet. Really incredible poet and personality. And just before he died, I mean, you know, you could actually, there was this thing about going to Paris and trying to find Ted Jones. He used to hang out in this cafe in Paris, this particular cafe. And I went looking for him one time. I was in Paris, and he wasn't around. So I never got to meet him. And then he died a few years after that. But when James introduced me to these writers, I began to see at that time that rather than being isolated in the UK, where it was really impossible for me to find like-minded writers, that I was part of a tradition of Black Surrealist writers, of which Henry Dumas, who's another African-American Surrealist writer, Ted Jones, and a few other people, even Samuel Delany, people like that. I'd long felt in my work that I was searching for some core truth, for something within but yet outside of language. What I was searching for was the infinite silence between the drumbeat, the poem with no words, the space of the interface, the core text, the spiritual. I was interested in the point at which the Baptist minister's voice breaks and he begins to chant in glossolalia. As Madame Sarap writes, conscious discourse is rather like those manuscripts where a first text has been rubbed out and covered by a second. In such manuscripts, the first text can be glimpsed through the gaps in the second. The true speech, the unconscious, breaks through usually in a veiled and incomprehensible form. And it was around this time that I started working on my second collection, Terragaton, which was published in 1997. James wrote the preface. And I think that these original copies are like hundreds of pounds on Amazon now, which is great. I have a few at home, so I'm saving them. But for this book, yeah, I kind of went, I saw myself as a surrealist poet, and I really delved into it wholeheartedly. I was doing automatic practice every day for hours. I did this thing, I went through this period of time where I would write something and throw it away without rereading it. And I did that for a few weeks. And what that does, it gets rid of the ego. You know, you have this urge when you write something to suddenly look at it and see if it's good or not, and to go, wow, that's a great poem. But if you take that urge away, you end up with a situation where you're not scared. You have no fear. And you can just write whatever you wish. And that's what I did. So I did this whole surrealist practice. I was really interested in the unconscious and finding a way to access it and to really do the thing where I was searching for that core text. And because I was working in a bookshop, I had access to all the books that I needed. And that was just another book that I did with Salt, which is another surrealist thing. For this book, I actually invented a surrealist technique, which I've never told anyone what I've done. And I'm not going to do it now, but yeah, I can't tell you, but I produced these, I wrote 100 poems in with this particular method. It's amazing. And then I made the book, and I just, didn't tell anyone. It's a secret. So yeah, from that point, surrealism became the center of my practice. I still very much see myself as a surrealist poet, but I think surrealism has limits. As practice, definitely as practice, there are limits to surrealism in that if you do it often, if you do surrealist practice and automatic writing over and over again, you begin to repeat yourself. You begin to find that certain motifs and certain models and certain images begin to repeat on you, because no one knows everything, So you begin to go backwards on yourself. And you come up against limits. So at some point, what I wanted to do was to merge surrealism with, finding my own voice, my own interest with language, poetry, and being a Caribbean person and trying to find something within that. And hopefully when I read the poems, they will make sense. So yeah, that's kind of it. I mean, we're coming up to the end of this particular section. I just wanted to, this was a first novel that I did, which was the kind of Afrofuturist surrealism, crazy stuff. So I just think it's a cool cover, so I wanted to show off a bit. And that's another novel. Yeah, you guys are a captive audience, so. But yeah, I want to briefly touch on this as a way of concluding, to try to bring it back, to try to bring the focus of surrealism back to the Black subjectivity. Leopold Senghor was a surrealist poet and the first president or prime minister of Senegal, says, European surrealism is empirical. African surrealism is mystical and metaphorical. And here's another quote from D. Scott Miller. D. Scott Miller wrote a very important text called the Afro-Surreal Manifesto, which you can definitely find online, in which he kind of lays out a map for Black writers to be surrealist, to sort of enter into surrealism and not feel like an outsider. Because, as a Black writer, a lot of these European isms feel often like impenetrable for us, like we're not part of the club. But D. Scott Miller says, Afro-surrealism is drifting into contemporary culture on a rowboat with no oars, entering the city to hunt down clues for the cure to this ancient, incurable disease called Western civilization. I want to now just read a few poems from this collection, which, as I said, hopefully illustrate some of the things that I was talking about. This is a poem called Ting, T-I-N-G, which is the way in Trinidad we say thing. Thing. Songtrack, Betty Davis, 70s blues. In a hot brown field in a shack with a beautiful woman. In the field, a house of drawers, behind us a stadium where from our front door sunshade reflects sprinters in grainy close-up of blue thighs flashing. Our cat dog his long legs wear stockings. Booker White, Aberdeen, Mississippi blues. We run from the horned wild boar with the shaggy fur over the chicken wire, her white dress exploding. New location, My Tower Junction, 3 a.m. A woman across the sidewalk, her head against the wall. She has a jerry curl afro which bleeds a bloodstream onto the street. She tells me why when I walk past the second time. Behind the wall is a hospital emergency unit where the pharmacy used to be. Big headlights, a Volkswagen ambulance. The receptionist shows me brown children on other children's bicycles. Tells me to walk the bleeding home to my tower, which is a village up the hill to our left. The bleeding agrees, already up and walking, holding her head. I tell the receptionist, Booker White, Pine Bluff, Arkansas. I'd take a cab, but I'm broke till I get paid tomorrow. We laugh. She gives me £3. Where was I coming from? The stadium, an Australian desert, running from Beast, the university? Are you a communist? Booker White, the Panama Limited. Camille, a small painting. This is a poem from that surrealist period when I was really discovering surrealism. And it was a take on. I was working in the bookshop, and I was looking at all these books on African art that were written by Europeans. And this is what came out of it. Camille, a small painting. Camille, a small painting. The so-called white lady opposite the Tiva renowned as Thatcher's, Blier, 1987, a veritable hypercast, Akuaba, it has been, Fantidol, clearly suspended from his neck or libel. 140, 141, wooden, terracotta, knock, culture, bronze, clearly defined. Infantile, although the face is bearded, fetish lids, an imported mirror. The fewer the lid himself, the lids vary in complexity. Some sculptures are kept wrapped. The fierce body, we removed its garments. Fetish figure, 9 days later to be burned. Smallpox, African mask, monozylus, i.e., to represent water out of a single block of wood. Mask of identical appearance, Bayaka eyes and the elbows on the knees, mythical creatures, Obo, Ekiti, Cassava, Lobi, modern place names, woman holding a fan, now bent, Reuben, height, 4.5 inches, Oren, length, 8.5 inches, Camel, a small painting. Bosch's vision. It started as I was leaving, with a dim groan in the afternoon. I saw my grandmother embrace me in her hand-stitched dress and wrench my soul cage open. I saw vistas of apocalyptic Europe, heard obscure tongues, still sudden now the sky become peppered with woe. Slack-eyed soldiers were howling in the wind. Botched leper experiments and gene mutations with veins hung like vervain from the neck. The sun long gone and weeping. The oil, the devil. No doubt it was the devil who chased color from the earth, who left sulfur where he spoke like a jitney carburetor. No doubt it was the devil, twisted muscle of night, who cracked the sky glass lid. Mama, tell me again why I should leave this island. Tell me again that those cities exist. All I know of the ocean is that a river starts here. The day I left Mount Lambert, the wardrobe doors would gleam. It was a day like any other. Wood slaves ran and wood slaves waited. Lovers lay against the salmon trees. Cattle grazed and bachaks burned in matchbox discotheques. But we were going to the airport, and my brother in the back seat is him I ask, is me this happening to? Capybara. Everyone know what a capybara is? Right. In Trinidad, we eat them. I don't know how to get this back up, but it's fine. Capybara. Cool and dead like long brown shoes in an acacia coffin. Rimmed like a nation of Baptist promises and desirable bells. With sapphire skin, thin skin of night, who hurried back to San Juan, whose right side of hip belonged to pleasure, who came shuddering in the dining room on a black leather chair deep in athletic water, who hummingbirds in black pitch bush died alone in the house of the capybara. And Trinidad, pinpricked with departments at the Ministry of Light, push those waves of fizzing foam from your throat. Your sister waits in those Hindu hills, her laugh, and see her airport uniform nestled in the footfall of that nauseous heaven like dust on the roof of time. Every subtle twitch, Her very intention remained in the church. But the deacon brewed the turbulence of an ill-fitting Jesus, and in port of Spain, the cold capybara's brain is lifted up and eaten. Its eyes still flash, Venetian red in the latitude of these cruel trees. I fall in love too easily. Probably just read a couple more. Yeah. Wish I could get this back. I know it's a distraction, isn't it? Getting to see all the innards of the thing, but the mouse doesn't seem to work, so I can't. It's okay. This is a poem called Poem for Franklin Rosemont. Franklin Rosemont was the founder and the sort of guiding light of the Chicago Surrealist group. And many years ago, he was putting an anthology together with a guy called Robin Kelly, who's also from Chicago. They were putting an anthology together called Black, Brown, and Beige, which was the first ever anthology of as I said, surrealist writing from the African diaspora, essentially. So there's a lot of Caribbean poets, writers in there, African scholars. It's an amazing collection, Black, Brown, and Beige, edited by Franklin Rosemont and Robin Kelly. And Rosemont actually got in touch with me directly and emailed me and asked me to submit some work. And I think he died before the book was published. Poem for Franklin Rosemont. Beyond words or destinations, visual and multiplying, intricate and persistent, they found a faraway place in Paris. Its potential splendor hid sequels and contrary sects in the early hours of 1960. Proclivities of struggle and synthesis within the most complete utopia of fire and speed. Dream letters were drowned in invisible stars. Silent suburbs of jazz and primitive hell were spontaneously glimpsed in rigid cities in which these souvenirs were read at the Chicago Public Library, shuddering loosely on the avenue between Green and Zion. These are the definitions of the Palace of Signs. These are the masks with which I hitchhiked across the wonderland and traveled by radio to resemble that mask, eccentric and boundless in the image of you. Past stairs and doorways, past Afro-American ruins, bamboo by the dozen among these denizens of marvelous film, dead yet actually distant, exhilarating like dissident blues swung from the Zydeco to the bruised suburbs of Pharaoh Saunders, emerging from light into some literary response. And I will finish with kind of a newer poem that's not in it's not in a collection. It was actually something that I do. Well, I don't really do it very often with my band. It started off as it's essentially a song lyric, but I'm a poet, so I don't sing, so it's hard to say it's a song lyric. But it's from a song called "On the Move" that we recorded in 2018, and it's on the move after Leanne Strauss. Leanne Strauss is a New York poet who actually used to work with me and Toby back in the day in Birkbeck. I don't know if you remember that. Yeah. Fine poet. She left now. I think she's back in the US. But I did a reading with her many years ago. And she had a new book out and she was doing this poem. And in the middle of the poem, just for a couple of lines, there was this rhythmic thing that she was doing. And I stole it. I stole it. I kind of stole the rhythm, but I told her, I said, Leanne, I really love what you were doing rhythmically there. I'm going to use that. And she said, fine. So every time I do this poem, I say after Leanne Strauss, with respect to her. On the Move, after Leanne Strauss. It was raining like a verb, like bone. It was July, hard road, maybe Marseille, up the mountain, acrobatic. It was skin, it was hip, back home, it was written, Port of Spain. We walked along, heavy light, copper septic, heavy rain. What was that? That was thunder, wind that blew us out of sync, scenic time. It was odd, a kind of shrimp. Caribbean, it was pulled back to reveal it. It was London, we were sailing, we kept on it. It was midnight, we were moving. Purple River, insect bone. It was a lie. No, it wasn't. It was the truth, maybe more like a long con, like love, as an anchor pulls us under. It was repeated like a chant, like a hymn, like a dirge, like a bell. It was gravel, rugged pitch, a blow that left a wound in water, wild fever, fever grass. It was patchouli, orange blossom. It was something like madness. It was painted with desire, Baptist heat, so elastic, glossolalia, spirit talking. Once, when freedom had meaning like organs of heat in the evening, my body held vibrations of the Caribbean, and we let bled that excess negritude of being. But the past didn't last long. It grew tired, and we wept in forests where black myth was painted in that acrobatic silence, and now my soul still holds the aroma of anguish. Do not gaze, not too long, upon the past. It's so dissonant, bass notes, sky church, steady dying. We were waiting to burst out of human life into brightness, heading east to the ocean, too shallow, too drowning, rugged steep. We were coming back from drowning, Manzanilla, old plantation. History was all around us. It was fluid, rhythm motion on the move. So shallow is this memory that it pierced me like Chiwakahuan arrowhead, drowned it in double-beaten goatskin drums from gust and plywood junctions where bliss-throat sparkles there, like sea silt and jettyfish near Port Authority where cruise ships landed to this dreamscape contemplating the road, our verge of memory split with cane like Camboulay in a place where everything happens at once. Thank you for listening.
You need to be close now. Thank you very much. It was such a pleasure to listen to the lecture, hear your ideas, and then see the practice. So we got the surrealist kind of theory practice there. So I'm going to come to you fairly quickly for questions. I'm not sure if there are any questions online. No. So be thinking of them. I wanted to just ask something quickly about Calypso, because you spoke about it, and this kind of manifestation. This that 10,000 people involved in a surrealist action, which probably is a world record. I think not that anyone was particularly concerned about it, but is that how does that change a society? Because this is well, like you said, it's a very small place in terms of square meters, but what does it? If the majority of people in the society have been involved in surrealist action, does it not make it a healthier society, mentally healthier? Is it not? Because the idea of surrealism for a lot of people, it was interesting you say that people have stopped doing automatic writing. Yeah. What happens? Why would people stop doing it privately if it was a way of and what does it mean if a whole society is engaged in surrealism?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and there's a lot of writers like Lovelace talks about that as well. That we've lost it. It's the same old story that once things become commercialized, like the carnival has become really commercialized now. So Minshall, that generation of mass makers in the 80s. There's very few of them left that are doing it on that level. Now it's what we call the bikini bands. So people are buying these, skimpy costumes, and it's very different. It's very commercial. So you still have the huge bands, but the purpose of it is not the same as it was. What Minchell was doing was performance art, essentially. Now it's different. It's more of it's hedonistic now. It's more completely hedonistic, which I guess is still a surrealist practice in a way. But the question of, does that change a society? Well, Carnival definitely has molded the Trinidadian society into something which is quite unique and special, I think. Trinidad is a very multicultural, multi-stranded, complex, layered society where there's a lot of money, but there's a lot of poverty. There's a lot of hedonism, but there's a lot of not austerity, but it's still conservative. So we exist with this sort of double thing constantly. So it's a very interesting society. And that is shaped by Carnival. Because, of course, the Carnival is the space for everyone to put a mask on and be who they want. And then on Wednesday, when that's finished, they take the mask off and go back to the office. They go back to be lawyers and doctors and stuff. So that shaped society and the politics and everything in Trinidad. The other question about automatic writing, I don't know. I think people still do it. I think writers are still using it, but maybe they don't call it automatic writing. Maybe they call it morning pages, or they call it, free writing or whatever. But when I was into it, I would write for a long time, not for 10 minutes in the morning. I'd be like, an hour until when my handwriting was a lot better then. The hand would just get tired and do its own thing, I find I can't write as well as I used to, because maybe I use a laptop now a lot. But do you find that your handwriting is crap? Yeah. Anyway, yeah, sorry.
We've all got doctor's handwriting.
Yeah, it's terrible.
So I'm going to turn straight away to the audience to see if they have any questions. I mean, I was practically booking myself on the next flight. But and then I realized I need to wear a bikini, so I've already saved myself that booking, because the costumes, it's like the most amazing thing you've ever seen.
Yeah, it's crazy.
I couldn't even figure out. That person seems to be wearing the entire night sky behind them. So I'm turning to the audience if you have any questions. Thank you. At the back, I think we're waiting for a microphone to reach you. If you could just hold off for a second. It's for the people online as well. Thank you.
Hello, Dr. Joseph. I'm from film department. So when you're bringing the surrealism music and also the surrealism writing, I was kind of thinking a discussion with my friends and students today is about the surrealism, like what we are having like in cinema. And so we were discussed, like, because of all the technologies, like we are in cinema, like it helped us to understand, or we're trying to give us this surrealism feeling like in the film. But then we talk about the novels, say, like basically like this time we are doing the same thing, even people are doing like surrealism writing or in novel fictions. But I said maybe it's not true, because we are not in the same writing ways, like you're writing something on the paper or typing. So I would like to think about your thinking about this surrealism writing or the surrealism music. Actually, to be honest, could you please also explain a little bit more about the surrealism music? I'm really interested in that part as well. Thank you.
I don't know where to start. I mean, what are you asking me? Is there surrealism in music? Is that what you?
Yeah. I basically have like two questions. Like, okay. One is like I want to hear more like your surrealism music. You mentioned about the practical way in the surrealism music, and the other one. And also the second question is about what do you think, like in writing, especially you're doing poem as well. So what do you think, like when you are doing this kind of writing today, what is the difference between, back to your writing things?
Oh gosh.
Thank you.
I think, okay, let me start at the first, the last one you asked. I mean, process wise, I mean, I still write the same as I always have. I still follow the same practices, but I don't. I mean, during the 90s, I was really obsessed with with surrealism, and I was writing. I was writing religiously every day and doing particular practices every day and every day and every day. But it changed after a while. I kind of learned my craft. It's like a craft. It's like learning to play an instrument. You know, you learn to play the instrument, and then after that, you can express yourself on the instrument. You don't have to do the same practices you did at the beginning. You can do other practices. So now I do other practices. Um, but I still write with a lot of risk and a lot of chance and I take a lot of risk with writing, and I use a lot of found sound in the writing. So gosh, it's for an example, if I'm sitting on a train writing and someone says something a few carriages away and I catch it, it might end up in the poem. It just gets pulled into the poem. So that's the way I kind of work with surrealism now. I find different ways of adapting it into the work through chance and risk. Um, the other question about music, there's a lot of examples of surrealism in music, although Lee Scratch Perry, the Jamaican producer, was a real surrealist, in terms of how he put music together. And, there's lots of stories of him doing crazy stuff, like recording a toilet flushing or putting a microphone out in a field to record a tree. And, really weird stuff that he was doing, trying to capture sort of natural sounds or accidents. Sometimes someone drops a glass in the studio and it breaks and it ends up on the record. So I think that's a form of surrealism. I think dub, the remixing something and creating something new, is a form of surrealism. I think with all of these isms that we are allowed over time to stretch the definition and the practice of it. So Breton, created the surrealist movement and these surrealist rules, but 100 years after, we are more than able to expand the sort of parameters of what surrealist practice is. I think that's what we're doing.
Got two questions, but you're not going to tell us the secret.
Oh, not what I did.
No, I'm going to get that over dinner. So we've got two questions. So at the back, if you could wait, and then we'll come to Emily.
Hi. Yeah, just to kind of bounce off of that, what you just said. I'm kind of interested in why is surrealism the word? Because like you were saying that, like, we can call it automatic writing, we call it morning pages, whatever, and that kind of, as time has gone on, it becomes a more capacious word, right?
Yeah.
What is it that you, and I guess it's probably changed for you as well, right? But I wanted to ask if you could talk a bit more about like why surrealism is such a useful frame for you there.
It's because of the fundamental belief within surrealism that surrealism could have access to something which is true. There's a degree of truth in I think what Breton was searching for was a degree of truth. And I think for me, what surrealism is the super real, the reality above the reality that we live. So a lot of people have this assumption that surrealism is somehow, the unconscious is somehow below consciousness, and that the conscious mind is the premier mind, and that surrealism exists as some sort of crazy underbelly. I don't see it like that. I think the surrealist mind, or the unconscious mind, is above this reality that we think we live, because it's unfiltered, and it's, you can actually do some meditation where you try to focus on your unconscious and what's actually going on, and it's chaotic. There's a lot of stuff just swirling around and stuff like that. But that is life. That to me is realer than things where we put everything in partition and censor, and what Huxley talks about, the doors of perception. It's the same sort of thing. When the doors of perception are open, you begin to see the real world. So I think that's what surrealism gave me. A sense that what's really going on in the mind is a lot of chaos, and what we filter through and decide to show is just that. It's just what we decide to show, but it's not the real thing. So that's why I think it's still important for me to say that it's surrealism, because it's a political act. It's like calling yourself a black writer. It's a political act. So yeah.
Thank you.
Hiya, thanks so much for that. And I guess my question leads on quite nicely from that one. I think you're right to make a distinction between surrealism as practice and surrealism as effect. And I think you did a really good, really interesting job of sort of recontextualizing this form of surrealism as one, away from like Eurocentric politics and stuff.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm wondering is if we can be more expansive about what we think of as surrealism, particularly in this context, then are we at risk of depoliticizing surrealism? And I sort of guess, how can we detect surrealism if it becomes more and more expansive? And I guess I just wondered if you could talk a little bit perhaps about the tension between this expressly sort of political kernel of surrealism and what happens when we sort of start to notice surrealism not as practice but as effect, and whether it can sort of still carry that kind of political force.
I don't know. I mean, I know that going back to Breton, I know that the surrealism that Breton had envisioned was kind of a failure in the sense that it didn't change the world. It didn't change, the political sphere. It didn't have that much impact on people politically. It just didn't. And I don't think it does that now. I don't think it has that possibility of really impacting people on a political level anymore. I don't know. I don't think so. But I would say that, with technology that we have now, like AI and stuff like that, that's really interesting. And there's some interesting stuff that's going to happen around AI and artificial intelligence and art and creativity and politics. I don't know the future, but I think we're on a cusp of something, I mean, is AI surrealist? Is it, does it have sort of surrealist possibilities within the concept of a machine or a series of software paradigms creating a degree of consciousness? Is that a form of a super consciousness? Is that a super surreal? I don't know, but I don't know if the original impulse of surrealism to sort of find a way of breaking down this bourgeois, coming out of World War I and breaking down bourgeois society. And I don't know if we're at that point. I think the world has become so different. In Breton's time, we did not have knowledge of what the rest of the world was doing, It was very hard. Now everyone can see each other. So it's a very different world. The world is flat now. It's kind of, we can all see each other. It's very different. So I don't know. I don't know if that answers, but yeah.
We're back to FT Prince, that which we know but we do not know,
Yeah.
which was a very well done for ending on that. So thank you very much to Anthony Joseph for his amazing lecture, which I think was very true to the spirit of FT Prince in the sense of it's about the contemporary and it's about now, but also looking back 100 years. And thank you for your questions. Thank you for attending online. But most of all, thank you to Anthony Joseph for coming.